Now that we have our model and organized over here in our outliner, and our UV spaces are set, we can now export these maps and begin the texture. So underneath the image menu, you have this UV snapshot. Now to make this work, you have to make sure you have the actual geometry selected. Let me turn on my selection highlighting so you can see. I'm not just selecting the groups like this, right? I'm selecting the geometry at its root level. So if I hit F inside my outliner, it would go to my selection, and you'll see I have just the geometry selected, not the groups. Alright. With the geometry selected, I'll come up into my UV editor and I'll go to Image and UV Snapshot. This pulls up a window for the snapshot options, and what you want to do is navigate. So go to click on Browse. You can navigate to a location you want to save these. So I have it in my textures folder I've created. Alright, and now I need to give it a name, so I'd call it wagon_UV. Go ahead and say save. So that just sets up where it's going to save and how it's going to save. It hasn't done anything yet. The next thing I want to say is what image format. So I'm going to make sure I have TIFF selected. What size of resolution? 2048 by 2048 will be good. Enough pixel resolution. We'll keep all of these things the same. You can decide if you want your edge color to be what you want it to be. White is okay. Now for the UV tiles, we have this right now. Let's deselect that. In the U space, we have 1, 2. In the V, we only have 1 space. So I'm going to go ahead and say I want the tiles, I want up to 2. And for the V, I want to 1. And now I'll click on Apply. And now it's exported some stuff for me. So let's go into Photoshop. We'll say File, Open. And you'll see I have UV U1 V1 and UV U2 V1. So this is going to be both my wagon wheel and my wagon basket. So I have both ready for me. And now we can go and start to prep this for texturing. So I'll take this U space, and what you'll notice in Photoshop, because we saved it as a TIFF, it's going to have an alpha channel. And alpha channel, if you click on it, it just turns red, and that's just showing me red is black and white is transparent, or the red is the opaque part, right? An alpha channel inside of Photoshop is essentially a channel that can store transparency, and anything white on an alpha channel is going to be transparent, black is going to be opaque, and then gray is going to be whatever value it is, in the transparency will be in between at a percentage. So if it was a value of 10, it would be 10% opaque. So this is nice because what we can actually do is we can load any alpha channel here just by holding Control or Command and clicking over this image, and now you can see it's loaded the selection of just the white lines, and it's done a near perfect job of loading that selection. So we'll go back into the layers. Let's create a new layer, and I'm going to go ahead and create or paint bucket those lines black. Actually, let's just make it a color so we can see what we're doing. So I'm going to fill them blue. Now deselect, Command D or Control D, delete the background layer, and what you see is you're left with these perfect lines for your texture. So I'll create one new layer underneath and just paint bucket that in the medium gray. And now we have our UVs, and we'll call this one our BG. Let's go do it for our wagon basket as well. So once again, I go to the channels, load it, go to my layers, make a new layer, paint bucket, the blue, delete the background, make a new layer, deselect, and paint bucket that in gray. So this will become the UV, and this will become the BG. Cool. So one thing I like to do is I like to make a selection using my magic wand tool. And we want to make sure we have contiguous turned on. And I just make a selection over in between basically all of my UV shells. So once I've done that, I can now invert that selection, right? And now I'll go select, which is Command-Shift-I. So select inverse right there. And now I go ahead and select, modify, expand. And let's expand 20 pixels, that's okay. So this basically expanded my selection. I'm going to create a new group here. And we're just going to mask that group. So now anything, if I just paint bucket, for example, just to kind of illustrate what's happening here, it stays perfectly within that group there. Make my background a little darker. So I have this nice sort of UV shell outline. So it's just kind of convenient. Helps you visualize where your shells are. And that way when I hide my UVs later, I still have a good idea where the UV shells are. Let's kind of do the same thing on this side for the wagon wheel. So I'll grab my magic wand tool, load, make a selection that goes basically in between all the shapes. We'll inverse the selection, right? Select inverse. Okay. And now we will select, modify, expand. Let's try this one just a little few, more like 10 pixels maybe. Doesn't need to be much, just outside the borders, right? And now we'll go to a new layer. We'll group that layer. We'll call this our textures. And then we'll go ahead and mask it. So if this is going to be our color base, I can go ahead and paint bucket that. And this mask, right? So when you have a selection and you just click make a new mask, it will turn that selection into a mask for that layer. Let's just illustrate that point one more time. I'll just make a random new layer here. Go ahead and paint something on it. Right? So if I just make a selection here like that, I click on this layer and I say make a new mask, it's going to make a mask based on that selection. So I can move what's inside there, or I can actually move the mask around itself. Or I can link the two so that every time I transform one, the mask will move with it. Regardless, that's just a little bit about masking. You can load the selection for the mask, you can load the selection for your paint, but it creates this extra, and it's actually going to exist over here in the alpha. So you can see layer 1 mask is right there. Don't need it though, don't need that one, so we'll just turn this back on. And now we're ready to start texturing. So we have our UVs inside of Photoshop. We've sort of organized this. Now, as opposed to calling this textures, I'm going to call this first one color. And I'll do the same thing on this side. We'll call this our color. And then this can just be kind of the base for now. That'll be fine. And this is important because we're going to, inside this Photoshop document, we're going to carry all of the textures. So I'm actually going to rename this one, and this is going to be our wagon basket, since that's what I've been calling it. So we'll call it wagon basket underscore text. I think we just call it text for texture. Let's turn this into a PSD. Alright, make sure it has all the alpha and layers turned on. Wagon basket. Wago. Alright, so this is The reason I do this is going to hold all the textures, meaning because we're going to create textures for not just the color, but for the bump and for the specular as well. And they're all going to be saved inside of one Photoshop document. So I'm going to go ahead and save that one. And now I'm going to also go ahead and save this one. This will be called the wagon wheel as a PSD. Click, I'll call this wheel. And looks good to me, textures, so forth. Alright, there we go. So now we're ready to start painting our textures.